Hello, El Paso. Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where we share the fun of the big questions with you. My name is Dr. Kim Diaz, and I teach philosophy at EPCC.
And I'm a philosopher from the University of Texas at El Paso.
And what's your name?
Jules Simon.
That's right.
Thank you.
Yeah, so today we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Sylvia Peregrino. Dr. Sylvia Peregrino has served as a government professor at El Paso Community College since 2009. Dr. Peregrino is a first-generation college student. She has served as program evaluator for federal, state, and national foundation programs. Dr. Peregrino has a bachelor's degree in political science and Chicano studies from UTEP, a master's degree in urban policy and planning from the New School for Social Research, and a doctorate in educational leadership and policy studies from Arizona State University. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Should we start?
Yeah, let's just get right to it. We want to start off by just kind of generally, but it's a big question, you know, like what do you think of democracy? I mean, this season we're covering in a timely way the issue of democracy, and you know, for our viewers, it's a big issue right now. We're all preparing to vote, and people are voting. And what do you think of democracy in general?
I want to say something, interject here. We use the word, right? It's, you know, this person is a threat to our democracy. Well, what is democracy?
Well, if we were looking at it from a historical perspective, it's from the Greek, and it's rule of the people, right? And so looking at democracy, the way that it's evolved, in the United States, we have a representative democracy. And so in ancient Greece, and of course I wasn't there, so I don't know if it's true or not, but people were citizens, they took turns. I've been fortunate enough to have the chance to visit Greece, and I know sometimes if they considered somebody a threat to democracy, they could vote them off the island for 10 years. And so you know, maybe that's a practice that we should have here in the U.S. Like if we feel that you're a threat to democracy, you're out for 10 years, and then maybe after reflecting you can come back. Mm-hmm. And so you know, we're I guess as I was thinking about this, I think we're a work in progress. And so when you look at the founding, only certain individuals got to be citizens, only certain individuals got to participate in the political process. Today, we're more fortunate that we've opened up the participatory process to more groups, right? But I know that I always tell my students, you know, at least half of you as women, you wouldn't have been allowed to vote. For people of color, technically they had the right to vote, but in practice, with poll taxes, with literacy tests, they made it more difficult for people to vote. And so really, we haven't really had the right to vote for African Americans and people of color until maybe like the 1965 Voting Rights Act, right? And so I feel that it's important for students to know that history, because I think we take it for granted that now everybody can vote. I know that as a professor, I try to encourage my students to register to vote, but sometimes I feel like it's pulling teeth. And I'm a certified voter deputy registrar, so I take registration cards to class, and I get sad sometimes because hardly any students want to have them. And so I know earlier this semester, Dr. Kim and I, in the forum, we held like a little voter registration activity, and I feel that was more successful. And then one of our colleagues also brought students so that they could hear about the importance of voting. And we did manage to get close to 60 people to register to vote just in a couple of hours on one Wednesday morning in particular. So I think it's more about that, not knowing the history. And I know when our colleague our colleague Laura brought her classes, I mentioned that it's not just the presidential race, that there's also a lot of local races, local in the sense of the Texas Senate race, Texas House races, and then also local for mayor. And not only are we voting for mayor, some of us are also voting for city council, for the judges, for county commissioner. I know that I've gone over my ballot and there's 44 positions there, as well as a number of propositions from the city, whether or not we should. There was a quality of life bond election about 10 years ago, and because there were lawsuits, nothing ever really happened. And so now that it's been over 10 years, this was in 2012, they're going back to the voters and asking, do you still want to do it, even though now it might cost more, or do you want us to cancel the project? And then the county has various propositions looking at parks, looking at expanding their facilities, looking at an animal shelter, and another one dealing with the county UMC, whether or not we want to expand beds for people with cancer, for geriatric services. And so it's not just local elections that you're voting on, it's also county propositions, city propositions. And so I took the opportunity to come to this show to kind of pull up, do a plug for voting, because I think too often, maybe people get busy, and so they let other things get in the way, or maybe they don't feel that they know enough, and so I wanted to kind of encourage people that it's not just the presidential election, it's also a lot of other elections, but the presidential election is the one that's in the mind of a lot of individuals.
Yeah, but so that was a really detailed response,
Yes.
Kim. But I want to just follow up with our second question, actually. But it has to do with some of what you've been saying, and you said some people are not familiar with the issues, they don't know, or they don't have the time to vote, and you've traveled around the world, Sylvia, and Kim and I have as well, and we see that there's different governments, different ways to govern in different places in the world. And you also said this, that we're a work in progress, right? So why should we as educators or as citizens even encourage each other to think about voting, think what it means to vote, to think about democracy and why that's important for us?
Yeah, why is it important for us to stay informed and go out and vote?
Yeah, to think about, to prioritize even, that this is as important as my job, or maybe more important, or why is it important to think?
I think,
and get to, go ahead.
Well, it seems to me that we take it for granted, right? But why do we take it for granted, and why might it be a good idea for us not to take it for granted?
Well, I know that when I bring, in the past when I've had public officials come speak to my classes, they mention if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so if we're not there making the policy decisions, we're going to be taken advantage of, or our community's going to be ignored. And I think for some people, maybe they've seen different politicians and different eras, and they feel, hey, I'm struggling all the time. And so I think there's a lot of apathy, or also disdain for people in politics. I think that a lot of times they have negative stereotypes about political figures, that maybe they're in it to enrich themselves, or because they're they want the glory or the name recognition. I still believe that there's some good elected officials, and I've been fortunate enough to meet some or people that I've met in other contexts that I feel are genuinely there to make a difference. I think it's important because we're struggling, and so us as college professors and maybe as people with no kids. I know you have
he has kids.
Oh, okay. Well, myself and Dr. Kim, right? I don't even have a dog anymore. My dog passed away and I haven't bought another dog because it's expensive, right? The vaccines, the shots, the food, picking up after the pet. And so, so where was I going? I'm going with this in that we're rich. We're very privileged, and as faculty members, that we get to travel and sometimes with some help from our institutions. But I have my students post discussions, and some of them are just living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to pay the bills. And so if there's one candidate that says, I'm going to make things better, I'm going to lower food costs, I'm going to lower gas prices, then that's very appealing to some people. And I guess it's also about what realistically can be done, right? I know that I mentioned to my students that we haven't raised the minimum wage since I believe in 2009. Minimum wage is like $7.25 an hour. And if you're a restaurant worker, a service worker, it's half of that, right? Plus tips, right? And so people are struggling, and we're one of the richest countries in the world, and perhaps the people that are in power. And so often we talk about the US Senate as the millionaires club, right? And so if you yourself grew up in wealth, grew up privileged, you have no idea what it's like to be a single mom trying to raise 2 kids on a minimum wage job, right? Over the weekend, we hosted a debate, and I brought this question to some of the candidates, that we have 81,000 households as of 2021 here in El Paso that are working full-time, that are still living just above 200% above the poverty line. And so that's still struggling. And so I asked them, what policies would you support to make living, to make housing more affordable, to make groceries more affordable, to make healthcare more affordable? What would you do? And mind you, not every candidate was there, but I didn't really see a lot of talk about policy, right? And so for me, in my intro, you mentioned that I'm a first-generation college student. So I'm getting to be middle-aged now. I grew up, I went to college in the 90s, and I was fortunate enough to get some of the government programs that we have, like the Pell Grant. Mm-hmm. Tuition was much more affordable then. I know that, I was able to pay for my UTEP tuition with my Pell Grant, and then still have money for textbooks. And luckily, I also had a scholarship, and I was able to buy shoes for my younger siblings. And so, I think those days are gone. And these are policy decisions, right? So like in 2003, the Texas legislature gave the universities permission to set their own tuition rates. And what did they do? They all jacked it up, right? Because if the state is giving you less money, they're going to get the money from the consumer, right? From the students. And I think this is also, and maybe this is more your realm, maybe we went from considering a college education a public good to considering it more like a private good. And so in the 1970s, college tuition in California was free. It was more affordable. And I think maybe for the older generation, they look at young people and say, well, I went to school and I worked full time and I was able to pay tuition. Maybe unless they have children, maybe they don't realize how expensive it's gotten. I think for those issues, that's why you should care, because politicians set the minimum wage. We've had other states that raise their minimum wage because the federal government hasn't done it. I know here in Texas, we've had cities that want to give water breaks to their construction workers. And then the state has come back and said, no, that's not within your purview, right? That shouldn't be a thing. And we know Texas is hot, right? So to me, it's not a consideration. It should be something that's a human right, right? To be able to be hydrated and not die at work. But for some of our politicians, I guess they want to make sure everybody's on task. If they're getting paid, that they should not have water breaks or only take those during their lunch hour.
Well, even just on the water break issue, but I have a bigger question to ask of you in a moment. But even on the water break issue, it's even being hydrated to be able to work better for that day is important. But long-term health care, if you don't hydrate your body, you'll get kidney disease eventually, right? If you don't have the right kind of hydration throughout your work life. Right? So these are long-term health issues, right? They're not just, part of the problem and some of the things you've been talking about is short-term thinking, in terms of policy issues. We have short-term thinking, the job needs to get done, and so let's do it, and let's not think about the long-term consequences.
It reminds me of a scene from Modern Times when they bring in, in Modern Times, Charlie Chaplin is there tightening knobs for 8 hours, right? And they bring in a guy to do a lunch machine so that they don't take their lunch break, so that they can keep working throughout their lunch break. Anyway, a critique of this has been going on.
Yeah, but I want to come back to this issue about why in the United States we need to be more informed. And, our one of the questions the earlier questions on our list has to do with how well our democracy functions. And, if you're in government, you teach that, and I teach political philosophy, and so also does Kim. But we know that even though we're perhaps the wealthiest nation in the world with the biggest military and biggest domestic production, right? Industrial production. But in all the other kind of factors that judge how successful countries work, we're pretty far down on the list. Like in terms of education and healthcare, mortality rates, all those factors, the United States is not number one. The United States is number one in GDP and military prowess and a few other factors, but in all the kind of factors that affect our daily life, we're pretty well down on the list. And so you mentioned that, it's important to think about it because it relates to our life, but perhaps a bigger issue is that when we don't think about it, our whole quality of life in this country has gone down, frankly. And this kind of imbalance of we're really rich, but who's really rich, right? And is that representative of the whole democratic republic, right? Obviously not.
So do you think that we live in a well-functioning democracy? You also mentioned it's a work in progress.
Well, I said it's a work in progress in that when we were founded, probably Jules would be the only person that could vote if he had land, if he was, a good member of his colony, of his state. For us as women, we were considered property up until the 1900s, and maybe. For some people, they want to go back to that time where women stayed home, took care of the kids, but that's not the reality that we live in today. Most people can't just work one job and support a family, right? It takes two people working to even just make it, right? For like the lowering of the middle class, I think that's kind of based on tax policy, and that before, wealthier individuals would pay a higher tax rate. Starting in the 80s, we went down, and so we had bigger deficits. And in class, I always bring up that the last time the U.S. had a surplus was under Bill Clinton in the 90s, right?
That just popped into my head, right?
Yeah, then after Clinton, we had 9/11, we went into Iraq, into Afghanistan, we had some tax cuts, and so the country has been in deficits ever since George W. Bush and forward, right? And maybe that's also by design, because if you're in a deficit, you can say, well, we can't afford to do that. But the U.S. is kind of like a big, I guess, or the way that I've heard it described, we're an insurance company with an army. Because some of the bigger programs that we do are Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and right now some of us are kind of in the sandwich generation. I myself am an orphan, and so luckily, and that's how I ended up back in El Paso, because my mom got sick, so I moved back. I used to work in DC. Right now, the only person we're kind of looking over, and I just help a little bit, is my mother-in-law, right? So taking her to doctor's appointments because she's not mobile, and so I think for a lot of people, they're stuck in the middle. They might still be paying for their kids' college, and they might be taking care of elderly parents, right? And so one of the presidential candidates does have a plan that if you're on Medicare, you can stay in your home and get help that way. And so maybe recognizing that some people that are middle-aged are kind of still in that situation. And so I think our politicians should kind of look at real life situations, but perhaps if you're from a wealthier, privileged background, you never worried about those things, right? Because the nanny will take care of the kids, or I can put my aging parents in a retirement home and not worry about it. But that's not the reality for most Americans. And so I think it's important for people to look at what do they want to do, and then what have they done in the past, right? Because if and again, maybe it's also pie in the sky, right? Maybe they're saying this because they want to get elected, but you're hoping that some of these policies do get passed, right? In class, I try to talk to students about the earned income tax credit, because a lot of them are working, and you can get the earned income tax credit even if you don't have kids. If you're applying on your own, if you have children, you get a bigger credit, and I think the cutoff is somewhere around $34,000 a year, and that's a plan that both Republicans and a program that both Democrats and Republicans like, because it goes to people that are working, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think the parties also have different philosophies, right? One party is more about income redistribution. The other party believes that it should be up to the individual to kind of pull themselves up from their bootstraps. And so I think I know that I make my students look at the party platforms in class so that they can see what they believe on education, what do they believe on healthcare, what do they believe on immigration, because even us hosting this debate over the weekend, we gave them 2 minutes to respond. You really can't have a deep conversation about something, any complex issue, like in 2 minutes, right? It becomes a soundbite, and I sometimes think as Americans that we're getting dumber. we have, we have our phones, so we have like a little computer in our hand, but maybe that's led to people not reading, people, just looking at videos, at funny videos. I do find that a lot of students have misconceptions, and so, I think as educators, we want them to go research, to find the source, where are they getting that information, or to even look at the candidates' backgrounds, just so that they can see what they've done in the past, and if that's something that they support.
I would like to follow that with two questions, but you choose which one we go first. In terms of the party platforms, right, and the values, one is more focused on the individual and the other one is more focused on the community. And what role does freedom play in a democracy was our very big question. Like, what is freedom, right? And what role does it play in a democracy? Do we have to sacrifice some individual liberties or freedoms for the sake of living in a democracy? Maybe we could talk about that, and then later go into the role of truth in a democracy because of the information, right? We're watching TikTok or Instagram, and it may not be the truth.
And so.
Before you answer,
Sure.
just to maybe even clarify Kim's question a little bit more, is, historically, the United States has promoted a very strong ethos of individualism,
And
pulling
freedom.
up oneself by one's bootstraps, right? Even our electoral system, is based upon a kind of individualist ethic where states have strong rights, right, and things like that. But, and again, from an international perspective, it's not the case that other democracies act like this. Our democracy is different in that way, that we have this more individualist sort of orientation here. And I'm thinking of, say, the Scandinavian countries, or even some Asian countries, have a stronger kind of social network or social orientation than we do here in the United States. So
It's interesting because these other countries invest in the community to help the individual. So they still get to the individual, but by promoting social programs.
It's also historical. Like, I think after World War II, a lot of those countries were devastated, and so maybe they saw themselves as having a commitment to pull the country up. And I also do think it could be about race, because a lot of, like Denmark, they're more homogeneous countries.
Right.
And so I think here, and going back to the 80s, and I know all of us were alive in the 80s, whereas some of our audience might, have been just a DNA strand somewhere. I think Reagan really demonized people on welfare, people who were poor. There's a woman driving a Cadillac, and she's a welfare queen, and you're the sucker that's working to pay for her benefits, right?
Where they in his era, they defunded mental health institutes as well. I mean, that goes unnoticed sometimes.
Yeah, and that's where we get a lot of homeless people with mental issues, right? And so I guess to go to your question, I think that maybe after, so in terms of freedom, I joke around with the students that it's not just Santa that knows if you're naughty or nice, it's also the government, right? And we all carry our phones, and I know this has happened, that maybe you mentioned, I want to go on vacation here, or I'm thinking of traveling, and then you'll get an ad, right? And so your phone is spying on you. Not that that's the government per se, but after 9/11, we had we were trying to keep the country from another terrorist attack. And so there's secret courts, they can do secret wiretaps. I tell my students, don't Google how to make an explosive device, because you're going to end up on a watch list, right? And not, hopefully nobody does that for fun, right? And rightly so, we want to prevent those things from happening. But I do think that we gave up some of our freedoms after 9/11 to keep the country safe, right? So we were worried about terrorist cells that were in the country, and so we started monitoring certain groups, or if you said certain words. We did lose some of that after 9/11. I feel that maybe after COVID, we might feel like we're more in it together, or perhaps not, right? But I know, thinking back to COVID, we started thinking of farm workers as essential. We started thinking of people that were working at the grocery stores as essential. Us as faculty members, we were lucky enough that we could work virtually, but medical professionals, nurses, doctors, they were risking their lives. My partner's a nurse, and so I know that I told her, quit, they'll be, because we saw what was going on in New York, that they ran out of PPE, patient protection equipment. Right. And so I know I went and I didn't go, I ordered it online, right? I got some ponchos, and so I'm like, if they run out, wear the ponchos. She'd leave her clothes in the garage, we'd Lysol everything, and then she'd shower, because we were worried about bringing back the virus, right? They had to reuse masks because for a while there weren't enough masks, and so I think maybe, for those of us, and I guess all of the people currently, right, or who are cognizant, right, we lived through that, and so we're lucky that we're here. We lost stadiums full of people, right? We're fortunate that we made it, but that's what brought up wages, right? Because they couldn't find enough workers, because people died, people that were being essential, and this is again before vaccines, but even that became political. Mm-hmm. Whether or not you trusted the government enough to take a vaccine, or if you believed some of our elected officials that said, oh, it's like the flu, don't worry, and so everything's political. It's just that I guess some of us, maybe you get turned off when you're watching TV and you're seeing people arguing, and so maybe for young people, they don't want that negativity, and so they choose to focus on other things, and not just young people, maybe other people our age, maybe they're watching Netflix instead of watching two people arguing, because it can be toxic, I guess.
So what is I'll talk about the truth. So, but to me, there's a problem with that. I mean, I'll give my opinion, right? Because it's like, if you're not making your own choices and someone else is making them for you, I have a problem with that personally, and so hence this show and us having this conversation, right? But even if you try to make an informed decision and you watch the news or you read a newspaper, that doesn't mean that you're actually getting the truth. So where, what do we do where do we go from there?
We would have people look at sources, and I know what you're saying. So for us here, we're on EPCC TV. We're not backed by a big company. If perhaps you're reading some of the newspapers, some very wealthy individuals own the newspapers, so they're never going to criticize their owner. And that's happened in Vegas, that's happened in DC, and so I can see your point that it is a slanted perspective, right? But I think the problem is that back in older times, and actually I just watched a documentary about the Kennedy assassination, right? So we had one guy, Walter Cronkite, and everybody got their news from Walter Cronkite. And now we can get our news from, from one network, from another network, and the network is going to give you kind of also how they slant, if they slant more conservative, if they're more liberal, and so so I can see your point that I know. I in the past I've had people watch like a PBS NewsHour versus network TV, and even network TV, 30 seconds. I've gone on TV and they give you 30 seconds to answer something, right? So you're just getting like the basics or the minimum, But on the other hand, I personally don't have TikTok because I'm afraid that the Chinese will get my data. I could be a little paranoid about that, but I don't have that. But I know other people do, and they like that forum because they're seeing what's going on in the Middle East and maybe not the U.S. perspective, or they see the bombings, they see shattered bodies, and so some of that is gruesome, but you're not going to see that on national TV, right? Because maybe we're more on one side than the other, right? And so that's a difficult question, right? How much you want to delve into a topic, right? And what's true to you. Some of my colleagues, they listen to different podcasts, and so, and to me, I like to think about even a broken clock is right twice. Mm-hmm. And so, so I try to listen and try to see, okay, maybe I should go listen to that podcast and see what they're saying about that person and whether or not, I think it's true, or if they're also just spreading propaganda. So it's difficult because we have so many options, I think, and maybe not enough information that's even census statistics, I guess, could be misleading, right? So when you look at unemployment numbers, they're measuring just people actively looking for work. If you've given up, if you're no longer looking for work, you're not counted in those statistics.
You're still unemployed.
But you're still unemployed, yes, but perhaps not being counted because you're not actively seeking work.
Okay. Do you have?
Well, this is an interesting way that the conversation has gone. So this issue between freedom and truth, plays out in our society in how we have access to information even. And, in a democracy, it seems like, to just come back to our major big elephant in the room, right? In a democracy, it seems like we not only should be free to have access to information, and so we have all these, so we've developed or evolved, to have all these different options. We're not just Walter Cronkite news junkies anymore, right? We don't just get news from one source. We have now these multiple sources. But then what happens is that it's not even just special interests, but special interests that can get controlled easily by money, by a lot of wealth. And so there seems to be, just to come back to the earlier question about a well-functioning democracy, there seems to be some problems there about how we're managing this kind of information access, our education on how we filter the information, right? And then how that information comes about through like big wealthy donors and things like that, so that have huge influence, right? So even if we're, plain working class people, who care about our work and our family lives, our information sources and our educational access are just, constricted because of the way the way our society has evolved to where it is today. just to run for president, it cost billions of dollars now. Like, how did we get in such a pickle? It's just like, how do you even run a country if it takes so much money just to get into an office, to be a representative or something like that? Seems like there's a deep dysfunction going on.
Well, I know in class I cover a case called Citizens United.
Yeah.
And so the Supreme Court said corporations have free speech rights. And so that led to something called super PACs.
Yeah.
And so you can be, if I win the Texas Lotto tomorrow, I can fund my own candidate as long as I'm not coordinating with them. But there's people that if they have access to a super wealthy individual, that person can not bankroll. There are limits to how much you can give the candidate, but with super PACs, with 529 groups, you can give unlimited amounts, and sometimes you don't even know where that money is coming from. And so when you're watching the commercials, when they say, I'm so-and-so and I approve this message, it's from the campaign. But sometimes there's other groups that are pushing their agenda, and you don't know who's really behind them. But I think you bring up a good point. I try to joke around with the students, right? Because otherwise they'll be super
really
bored.
Serious, really
Yeah,
quick.
and depressing, right? So I tell them, maybe politicians should be like NASCAR drivers, right? And have the patches sponsored by Big Pharma, sponsored by the oil industry, sponsored by this corporation.
I like that idea, Sylvia.
Yeah, and that way where their loyalties lie, or where, and maybe it's not buying the politician, but buying access, right? So if they're going to see a bill that's going to impact the industry, then they're going to take that call from the lobbyist, right? And I think that's maybe why people are kind of disgusted with the process. So I know I make a big deal to tell them when people just take money from regular people and not corporations or PACs, then maybe you should look at those candidates more closely, because they're not beholden to those groups, right? So we've had some candidates that do that, but in a state as big as ours, it does take millions of dollars to run an ad. Texas is huge. I know we had the debate, but I had to stream it because we happen not to have that network in our community. So other parts of Texas got to see the Texas Senate debate. I'm forcing my students, my new students that start this semester, to watch it because it's online. But our regular people who don't have cable or who don't have satellite weren't able to view it unless they themselves went and got online. And so I think you make a good point that we are. We do have so much access to information, but we don't know where that's coming from. I know I myself have the New York Times educators subscription because that's also in decline. Newspapers, local reporters. We ourselves might not make the time to go to a county meeting or a city council meeting, and so we depend on our local newspaper reporters to go and get us that information, because otherwise, they're going to do whatever they want behind closed doors, right? Or maybe it'll be covered in local news. But I think a lot of people, might not be watching the news, given that there's, you could be watching the Avengers, right? And so maybe that's more fun than watching the local news, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these issues come down to the importance of education as well, because our students come to us already kind of indoctrinated, and wanting certain things about life, and part of that is that they're, they've been educated in such a way that they care more about their individual pleasure seeking, right, rather than engaging in the community in meaningful ways and things like that. And I don't know, I like when I grew up in a union household. My father was a union carpenter, and he was also then, politically engaged. So instead of, I watched kids shows on TV and things like that, but I also went to like community political events where people got around and talked about what was going on in the community and politics, and I'm not sure we have a lot of that going on today in our communities. It's a lot more, like you said, everybody's got their cell phone. If you look even take a bus or just walking down the street, people are on their cell phones all the time. It's not like there's a lot of community events and engagements that young people or even middle-aged regular people attend.
I know that ourselves as a government discipline, we've hosted a couple of events this semester, especially because it's an election year.
Yeah.
So we try with our limited resources. I think we've had maybe about 8 or 10 events. I know when we did the voter registration drive, we did that at almost every EPCC campus. There was one campus that had done it for Constitution Day, but we did simultaneous. So, and for those, we do offer extra credit for people to attend. Right. So we've had some mayoral debates. We've had some district representatives. So we try, and we do try to get the students to attend by offering that, making it an assignment or offering a carrot, here's some points. You mentioning the union led me to think about also, how union membership has declined in the US, and maybe that's also why we have less of a middle class, right? Mm-hmm. Also, with free trade, we move manufacturing to other countries where it's cheaper, and so we lost some of those good paying manufacturing jobs, right? I think we need to give young people a chance. Like I actually this weekend I went to the opening of they're reopening Planned Parenthood in El Paso, and there was a young woman who kind of talked about how she started volunteering there just because of medical conditions, right? And here I'm just talking about how she had PCOS, and so that led to like heavy periods, and so she was put on birth control, but then her, some of her family members were shaming her. She was doing it not necessarily because she was sexually active, but like as a health thing, and so that's why she was supportive of Planned Parenthood, right? And so I think that young people do want to be engaged and do want to be involved if we give them venues or opportunities. The state of Texas also doesn't want young people to be involved. The state of Texas passed a law that for graduation requirements, you can't require students to go do community service anywhere. You can't, they've passed laws that are against, not that we teach critical race theory in the K-12 level, but I guess in their mind, anything about race is political, right? But they did pass a law that for graduation, you can't require students to do volunteering or service. And so I do think the state likes the way things are, and so perhaps they're not that interested in getting more people engaged, right? Because perhaps if you have bigger voter turnout, you might have different results, right? I know earlier before we started taping, I mentioned that I was watching the Senate debate, and one thing that they brought up was that we registered in the past 2 years 2.8 million new voters. And so you don't necessarily know if those are young people or people coming from other states moving to Texas. But to me, that's encouraging. And so, you know, they're the future, right? We're, you know, I mean, hopefully, you know, I have another 30 years left in me, but, you know, but they'll be the ones paying for my Medicare, or actually, speaking of those big government programs, Medicare, Social Security, they're expected to be broke in 10 years, but nobody wants to talk about how to make those programs solvent. There were some. And I'm trying to think of his name, but he wanted to raise the retirement age to 70. And mind you, us that are in more white collar jobs, maybe we could work to 70. But people that are in the service industry, in construction, in medical care, you know, 70 might be hard to do those physical jobs, right? But because that was so unpopular, they kind of stopped talking about that. But in 10 years, we're going to be in a crisis, right? And so luckily we have the TRS for us, so we're okay. But people that don't have a private pension, that rely on Social Security, on Medicare, those programs are going to be broke in 10 years. And I guess, and speaking of short term, you know, nobody wants to look at that. So we're going to, maybe there's stuff that we could do now to make those programs solvent for another 10 years and then kick that to the next generation. But nobody wants to have those conversations, right? Because people don't like paying taxes, but they do like some of these government programs, right?
We want to have our cake and eat it too.
Yeah, and it's not just even a preference thing. I mean, this is if you want to be able to have a democratic system that depends on the people. It's come down to like really basic, childlike sort of ways to understand this, right? If it's a system that, you know, respects where the power is in the people, one has to take care of the people. Right? One has to take care of the workers, the people who are paying for the system and who are making the system work, right? It almost seems like, you know, there's one way to think about this in kind of big, broad brushstrokes, that we should prioritize taking care of the people versus taking care of the people who govern the people. You know, it's just like there's that kind of problem there. Like, I'm in control, right? And so, and I want to keep control. You said the state wants to keep it that right? They don't want to change. The state wants to keep things the way they are. That has to do with stability, but there's a different kind of, there are different ways to think about stability in the state.
Long term or short term.
Right? Short term and that kind of.
I want to ask a question.
Okay,
and we need to actually wrap it up soon. But yeah, so my insight in listening and speaking with the both of you is that we want people to be in control, right, in a democracy, but we don't really want to take responsibility for ourselves and the apathy or the cynicism that we have. So we kind of just let other people govern us, even though we still want a democracy and we want to have control over who governs us. So I see a problem with that, right? It's inconsistent. We're almost at the end, but I'd like to ask, what do you think is the ethical justification for us to continue wanting a democracy?
Well, I mean, I think we want to be free. I know that when I contrast ourselves with other nations, you know, I can talk smack about politicians and I'm not going to go to jail, right? Unless I'm actively planning an assassination attempt or something, right? But if I'm critical of
right.
politicians, I'm not going to disappear, I'm not going to go to jail, unless it's that I'm actively planning to take them out or something. And so that's not the case in other countries. In other countries, and so even in Mexico, right? If you're a journalist and you're writing certain things, and maybe you're exposing corruption or exposing drug traffickers, your life is in danger. I know I was recently in Mexico on a family trip, and they brought up the fact that there was a new mayor. He had been there 2 weeks, and they decapitated him. And so who wants to be mayor after that, right? If the last guy lost not only his job, he lost his head. And so, I think I shared an incident with both of you earlier. So I was one of the people doing the questions along with a journalist, a local journalist. And after the event, one of my colleagues told me that we, maybe people were under a misconception about what the event was. It was downtown at La Fe, and the event was surrounded by people, who maybe wanted to go in, and they were wearing political shirts. And so we told them that there wasn't political stuff allowed. And they did come in and maybe stayed for a little bit, took the tamales. We were worried for our safety, but I know one of the organizers called the police, right? But apparently they were driving trucks and honking, and even had a tractor, right? And so, so we were talking about how people are free in this country. I worry about perhaps voter intimidation, right? Here in Texas, we're open carry. So if I'm going to go to vote and then there's somebody outside with a gun, I might not feel safe walking into that space, right? Or I might be intimidated seeing somebody with a weapon, right? And so luckily, it didn't become violent, and little did they know that 2 of the sheriff's candidates are in there, 2 of the district attorneys. So you could get in trouble for disrupting for trespassing or disrupting a meeting, right? But of course, the event was open to everybody, and so we invited them, but we just didn't want people to be honking and disturbing the process, right?
And the democratic process should be free and free of intimidation. Right? I mean, that's part of what democracy should be all about, that you freely give your vote or freely have this access to information and things like that. So that's an important point.
And that's a perfect segue into telling people that early voting is going on October 21st through November 1st. Election day is November 5th. Right. And you can go to epcountyvotes.com to find the early voting location and to look at a sample of your ballot so that you can go in and be more informed. That's the concern in the future, right? I tell my students that I carry my passport card. Not that I'm going to go to Mexico anytime, but we, in the state of Texas, we passed something called SB4, that any law enforcement official can ask you about your citizenship. And so, maybe I'm doing yard work that day and I look a little frumpy. I'm coming out of the gym and I look, kind of like disheveled. Hey, you look undocumented to me, right? And SB4 allows law enforcement to deport you without due process, just automatically get out of the country. And I know that sometimes maybe people think, you're Chicken Little, like the sky is falling. But this happened under the Hoover administration. There was an operation called Operation Wetback, where they rounded up anybody who looked brown, regardless of their citizenship status, and moved them to Mexico. And so, one of the candidates wants to do mass deportations. How do you do mass deportations? Perhaps there's you stereotype that some people belong and some people don't belong, and unfortunately, in El Paso, we're like 85% Latino, and so maybe there's the assumption that all of us are undocumented, right? And so. So to me, I do worry that one of the candidate wants to get rid of birthright citizenship. It's in the platform. Another candidate wants to make home ownership more affordable, right? And so it just depends. If you don't vote, then yeah, like you said, you're letting somebody else decide for you, and they might not have your best interest at heart, right? Only you know what your best interests are.
Well, with such concrete observations on your part, Sylvia, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's important to remember that, democracy is up as an issue in this election cycle. It's very much on the ballot, and I think that all of our listeners, can be well instructed by our dialogue today.
Hopefully make a better decision.
And go and vote and be well informed. Engage in the democratic process. But thank you for the wonderful, stimulating conversation.
You guys had the hard questions, but I guess for me, I try to give examples.
A lot of information.
Oh no, they're great. They're great. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much for the invite.
Thank you to our viewers and our crew. Join us next time.